Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read Chapter 11 from my second book, Seven Sisters, Overland. Quincy, Illinois, had always been a welcoming community to any displaced persons who sought refuge there. They had occasion to help German immigrants, Negroes traveling from the south to the north, and even the Potawatomi Indians. So Quincy didn't hesitate to provide aid, shelter, and comfort when the distressed Mormons were fleeing persecution from riled up mobs in Missouri 25 years earlier. When the Saints first moved to Missouri, they hoped to live peacefully in the settlements they established there, but they were met with fierce resistance from rabble-rousing mobs who were intolerant of the Mormons and what they judged were their far-fetched beliefs. This culminated in the Missouri Mormon War of 1838, when the governor issued an executive order banishing the Saints from his state. Faced with extermination, thousands of Saints headed east and crossed the Mississippi River to Quincy, which they had heard would welcome them. It was treacherous for the Saints to cross the ice-filled water that time of year, but after an unusually cold spell, the river froze and many walked across the ice to the other side. Thousands of cold and hungry Saints eventually arrived in Quincy, where they found the citizens warm and hospitable. Housing was provided, and food, medicine, and blankets were freely given. The mayor of the city even established a committee to help raise money for the displaced Saints. About this time, the prophet Joseph escaped from Liberty Jail in Missouri and stayed a short time in Quincy before he began scouting the places where he could settle his followers permanently. He purchased some land 40 miles north of Quincy, where he planned to build a new city that would eventually become Nauvoo. After a few years, Nauvoo prospered greatly and grew to become the second largest city in Illinois. Then, in the winter of 1846, when the mob violence in Nauvoo forced the Saints from their homes, Quincy again came to the aid of the Saints by establishing the Democratic Association of Quincy, which ensured that the mobs in the surrounding area would leave the Mormons alone while they departed Illinois. The Saints had everlasting gratitude to the people of Quincy and felt almost a kinship with each of the good people they came in contact with there. The Quincy train station was as far west as the rails went in Illinois. Travelers had to connect with their next train ride on the other side of the Mississippi River. To get there, they had to board one of the two ferries which crossed back and forth. It was almost a mile across the river to get to the state of Missouri. The Saints now had a couple of hours to spend waiting in Quincy for the ferries which were presently fetching passengers on the other side of the river. They could use this time to stretch their legs and get food before they had to be lined up to go aboard. Now, in 1863, even though most of the Saints already moved west from Quincy, there was still a small contingency of Mormons who lived there temporarily while they worked to raise funds to continue on to the Salt Lake Valley with their families. When they earned sufficient funds, they would join with one of the pioneer companies that came through there periodically. President Tippett's flock was now joined by two such families who had been waiting for the next company to come through. They were staying there not because of lack of funds, but because of illness, and had been taken in by some of the remaining Saints in the area. One family had a father, a mother, and 3 adolescent children. The other had a mother and 5 little children. Since the Saints had a while to wait for the ferry, some sat under the trees, some strolled around the area, and many of the children played games and ran around. After purchasing food for that day and the next, the 7 sisters sat together, eating and observing all that went on around them. The temperature was less humid than usual, but the day was uncommonly beautiful, with nary a cloud in the sky. Soon their talk turned to the 2 new families. "Did you notice how that father was disciplining that widow's children?" said Lavinia. "That was rather presumptuous of him, don't you think?" Susanna joined the conversation. "He keeps giving them orders, and did you see when he gave that little one a swat on the rump because he wandered off?" Caroline couldn't resist. He seems to be taking liberties I wouldn't welcome from someone who wasn't my husband, although being a widow and left with 5 little children would be very difficult, I'm sure. As a matter of fact, sisters, Eleanor said, she isn't a widow at all. She's his second wife. Stars! Are they living in polygamy? Gasped Lavinia. It looks like it to me, said Eleanor. President Tippett told me the principle of plural marriage was officially announced 11 years ago in Utah, and we will see more of it among the saints as we travel west. I could never share my husband with another woman, said Susanna, secretly thinking about Marcus. I would be too jealous. If I ever lived the principle, said Caroline, I would have to be the first wife, so I got to approve of adding any other wives. You mean you'd consider it, said Susanna. Maybe I just wouldn't give my permission, Caroline laughed. That's one doctrine I don't understand about the church, said Lavinia, although it might be the only way I'll find a husband out west, men being so scarce. Eleanor interrupted the conversation. Well, when I questioned President Tippett more on the subject, he told me not to trouble myself about it. He said it is a holy principle, and if I can't see it now, to wait until I get to Zion, and all would turn out all right. The sisters were somewhat taken aback by being introduced to this new principle in this way. They wanted to discuss it further, but Eleanor's statement closed off the conversation as well as the speculation and gossip. They subsequently learned that the husband's name was Ezra Button, and his wives were referred to by their first names to ensure that they didn't both answer to Sister Button. Hence, the first wife was Sister Josephine, and the second wife was Sister Emily. The 7 sisters were fascinated by this unusual family. They began to look at Brother Button with new perspective and increased curiosity. They wanted to see how he treated his wives. Was there any jealousy manifested by them? Were their children treated equally? The sisters seemed to silently agree that this would be a difficult principle to comprehend and embrace. Phoebe and Fanny didn't quite understand what the sisters had been talking about. They were only interested in seeing if the 3 older children liked to play games or not. The 5 children of the second wife were far too young to participate. The oldest of the 5 couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Can we go play games until the fairy comes? Begged Fanny. Stay close enough you can see me, admonished Susanna. We will, said Phoebe, as they ran toward the new family. Hello, we're Phoebe and Fanny Watts, said Phoebe. Welcome to our company. We like to play games. We hope you do too. Do you want to play a game right now? The 3 looked at each other with anticipation, and then as their father, who looked at both of his wives, then at their father, who looked at both of his wives. They shrugged their shoulders, leaving him to make the decision. I think that would be an excellent idea, he said. We love games, said the tallest boy. I'm Bradford. This is Belva, and this is Bernice. These are our little brothers and sisters, Brewster, Bessie, Bartholomew, Babette, and Bridget. But they're too little to play anything except London Bridge. My goodness, that's a lot of B's to remember, said Fanny. It'll make it easy. I'll make it easy. Come on, Buttons. Let's get playing. The children played hard for a while and were wringing wet with sweat when they were called over to eat their lunch of bread and cheese. After they ate, the sisters decided to wander around for a few minutes and see what the different vendors at the depot were selling. Eleanor stayed with Linda May and the baby. Susanna took charge of the twins, and Caroline and Lavinia struck out together. Before long, the marketplace became quite crowded. Caroline stood by Lavinia's side for a while, but when Lavinia got distracted by a stand displaying straw hats and turned to tell Caroline about it, she couldn't see her anywhere. There was no place to get lost in the small area, but somehow they had become separated. Lavinia didn't worry too much about it. She figured Caroline would find her soon enough and wanted, in the worst way, to look at the stylish straw hats that were on display. She had never seen anything quite like them in England. She picked one up, the first one, that caught her eye. and tried to encircle the rim with her arms. She couldn't reach all the way around it. There was a pretty pink ribbon on each side that was designed to go under one's chin. She carefully placed it over her bun and settled it on her head. It felt incredibly comfortable. The saleslady turned on the charm. "That is a perfect fit, miss. Here, let me tie the bow." The clerk fashioned a bow under Lavinia's chin off to one side. Then she pulled the folds out to make a butterfly, a fluffy pink butterfly. "How does it look?" ventured Lavinia. "It looks like it was designed just for you. It will be invaluable for crossing the plains. I've sold many of these to the young Mormon girls stopping in our town." Lavinia picked up the young comment. She had never been one to wear flamboyant hats before. Her hats had always been small, dark, and conservative. She wondered if she dared be so bold. But since her sisters had changed her hairstyle and taught her how to dance and be sociable with men, she had gained a lot of confidence in herself. When you are trudging across the plains, you are going to want a hat that will protect your pretty face from the sun and keep the dirt out of your hair. The straw in this hat will breathe and keep you cooler than those heavy, unattractive cotton bonnets. Lavinia picked up on the pretty comment, but hesitated. "I have a small mirror," said the saleslady. "Would you like to see yourself?" The saleslady handed her a circular mirror with a lovely carved ivory frame and handle. Lavinia took a deep breath and held the mirror out as far as she could, hoping to reveal the entire brim of her hat. She moved her head this way and that, and began to smile with approval at what she saw. It was so daring. "I'll take it," she blurted out. Lavinia looked around for Caroline, but couldn't see her in the crowd. She surmised that she had probably gone back to the meadow, so she adjusted her new bonnet, kept her head down, and walked in that direction. When she got very close, she raised up her head. Her sisters all gasped and began to clap when they realized who it was. "Lavinia," said Phoebe, "what a beautiful hat! It makes you look so young." Lavinia was thrilled that her new hat was doing exactly what the saleslady said it would do. "Why, thank you, Phoebe. You look young, too." Everyone laughed. "Now, you look too young to be my mummy," Fanny giggled, remembering when she and Phoebe had to pretend Lavinia was their mother on board the Amazon. "So that's where you went," laughed Caroline. "I got distracted by a table of pies, and when I turned around, you weren't there. I just had to buy this hat. I couldn't resist it," said Lavinia. "I didn't have enough money to buy a pie," said Caroline, "but I did enjoy standing there and smelling the fragrant apples and spices for a few minutes." Lavinia got compliment after compliment on her new hat as the ladies crowded around to see it up close. But the compliment she desired most was one from George. When he finally noticed her, his face lit up and he smiled as he walked toward her. "I must say, Miss Triplet, that your new hat is very becoming. That pink bow brings out the color in your cheeks." Lavinia felt lightheaded. "Why, thank you, Brother Careless." Then, not knowing what to say, she added, "I like your hat, too." What an idiotic thing to say to a man, she thought. How could I be so mindless? Thank you, I guess." He chuckled as he straightened his brown felt hat. Lavinia tittered nervously as he excused himself to join the luggage crew for his duties there. "Why didn't someone kick me?" she whispered to her sisters, who were trying to suppress their amusement. When the ferry finally arrived on the Illinois side and loaded their passengers, the Saints filed on board in an orderly fashion, along with many other travelers who had accumulated on the wharf. The trip across the river took about an hour, but no one minded the time. They were all fascinated by the activity of the boats, steamers, tugs, scows, and barges that crossed their path. When they arrived on the Missouri side of the river, they could see a noticeable decline in the demeanor of the populace. The people were loud and slovenly in appearance. The whole landscape of the backward frontier seemed untamed and uncivilized. The saints had been warned about Missouri. It was a wild and lawless place, a hostile state, loaded with thoroughgoing Mormon haters and apostates who were responsible for driving the saints out at gunpoint. There were two things that made Missouri dangerous in 1863. First, it was in the middle of the Civil War zone, and second, it was an untamed state with many rapscallions who knew no laws, established no schools, and were without religious influence. The train on the Missouri side arrived just in time, for which the saints were thankful. They were anxious to get on board and get out of the sight and minds of the riffraff loitering around the train station. The train consisted of an engine and 5 boxcars. With boxcars, they would still be sitting on the floor, but boxcars were a step above cattle cars because they were more enclosed. They had 2 sliding windows on each side that could be opened to allow air and light inside. The best feature, the cars weren't laden with dung. As the saints traveled farther into Missouri, they could see the spirit of secession was prevalent. Everyone looked like they were in a state of excitement and confusion. The saints saw the several buildings had been burned down, and even one of the train stations they passed was in ashes. The rails had been dislodged so many times as a strategy to thwart the enemy that this part of their train ride was the roughest one yet. In the towns, there was a continual flashing of firearms by men of every conceivable level of drunkenness. Sister Schneider thought to impress this upon the minds of the twins. Be careful how you act and what you say while in the state, twinsies. The soldiers may just take offense and shoot you down dead. Then somebody will bury you, and that will be all the trouble there is to that. This frightened the twins and those who heard her say it. She didn't mince words. As they rode along, the saints in each car took turns looking out the 4 open windows. It gave them a chance to stretch and shake their legs for a few minutes before they had to sit back down for another period of time. It was the twins' turn to stand on the bucket and look out the window. They enjoyed the wind in their faces and through their hair. Lavinia sat with her sisters. She still had her new hat on because there was no place to set it down where it wouldn't be in danger of getting stepped on or sat on. She did, however, loosen the bow to make it cooler around her neck. She was quite comfortable sitting there where she was, and that is until the foot she was sitting on fell asleep. Of course, she didn't realize what was happening at the time until she shifted positions and an intense tingling began. "Oh, my foot's asleep," she said, getting up and tapping it lightly on the floor. She tried to walk around to make the tingling stop, but it just kept intensifying. She tried stamping it, but that only exacerbated the pain and the torture of what felt like hundreds of needles pricking the bottom of her foot. Eventually, the tingling started to subside. Since she was up, she moved to the window. "What are you seeing out there, twinsies? Want to take a look?" said Fanny. They both stepped down from the bucket to allow her to get a better view. Forgetting everything, she stuck her head out the window to take a look. Just then, the moving air caught the brim of her hat, and before she could catch a hold of the ribbons, her hat floated down the railroad tracks. "Oh, my beautiful hat," she cried disappointedly. Phoebe and Fanny patted her on the back. "Don't cry, Mummy. Don't cry," they consoled. These words shifted Lavinia back to reality. She began to see the total ridiculousness of the scene and straightened herself up. First a sleepy foot, and now a lost bonnet. That's plenty of tragedy for one day. Everyone around her laughed. Lavinia was getting to be more human all the time. "Sister Triplet," said George, stepping forward, "I'm so sorry you lost your beautiful hat, but you did express a liking to mine, and since I have 2 hats, would you please accept this one to protect your lovely complexion?" Lavinia knew she couldn't be caught in a lie, that she really didn't like his hat, but she'd make the best of the situation. "Why, kind sir, I would be delighted to accept the hat that I took such a fancy to earlier today." She placed his broad-rimmed felt hat on her head, and everyone laughed as it slid down over her ears. "It's plenty big, but I think it will stay on my head better than that old straw hat did." "Thank you kindly, Brother Careless." Lavinia began to like the hat George gave her. It wasn't as stylish, pretty, or feminine as her straw hat had been, but it had special meaning to her. It belonged to George, and now she had something of his that bonded them together. This hat was about half as big as her straw hat, and was made of felt. The brim could be turned either up or down. She bent it this way and that way, asking her sisters for their opinions. They liked it when she turned the back up and the front down, tilting it a little to one side. It had a leather chin strap that could be adjusted up or down. She looked like a real cowgirl in it. She determined to be extra careful with this hat. She didn't know if she would get a chance to buy another one before the western trek began. The train ride lasted a few more hours before the Saints arrived at New Cambria station for a food stop. As the boxcars dislodged their passengers, the Saints lined up for any instructions they might need to hear. President Tippett stood on the steps of the train. His flock smiled and waited for his message. He surprised them when he looked over the crowd and veered away from his expected announcement. "Sister Triplet, I see you have a new hat." The crowd chuckled. "I lost my straw hat while looking out the window of the train, President," she said, "and Brother Careless kindly offered me one of his 2 hats to wear." "It looks strangely flattering, Sister Triplet, but I understand if a young woman puts on a gentleman's hat, he has the right to kiss her." Lavinia's mouth fell open while the crowd tittered. She stammered for a moment. "Really? I had no idea," she said, trying to think of a clever retort. "Perhaps I should give it back to him." George's face began to match Lavinia's in color. He paused a moment until the crowd quieted down. "I have never heard of such a benefit for giving away hats to ladies in need." This time the men laughed in support of George. His confidence was boosted. President Tippett was becoming more comfortable in his role as leader and guardian of the Saints, and was beginning to show more of his humorous side. No, I just made that up, brothers and sisters," he admitted. This brought a huge sigh of relief from both Lavinia and George, but brought more laughter and chatter from the Saints. "Getting back to business," said Tippett. "I need to check the telegraph office, so if you could all wait here until I get back, I won't be long." Inside the office, he found a telegram waiting for him, instructing him to take the company of Saints south, away from the normal railroad route across Missouri, so they could avoid some pockets of Civil War fighting that had flared up through that area the last day or two. This was disheartening news for Tippett because the Saints would now have to change trains and go south to get to the Missouri River just so they could go back north in safety. It would add another day to their journey. After explaining the new change of plans to his less than receptive company, he concluded by saying, "Brothers and sisters, we must accept the wisdom and direction of our church agents, who know far better than we do about how to keep us safe in this part of the country. It looks like we will be here for about 3 hours before we can catch our new train. So those of you who have been selected to go on the food run, remember there is safety in numbers, so don't wander away from the protection of your group. The rest of us will move to the campgrounds, and the luggage captains can get our luggage off the car and ready to transport to the new train." Those going into the center of town were a little worried. This was their first stop of any length in an actual Missouri town. They were wondering what they would find there. Sure enough, it was as the leaders had described. They found drunken soldiers and Missourians sitting on the wooden walkway in front of the stores, or leaning against buildings or hitching posts, laughing, drinking, profaning, chewing, and spitting tobacco. and casting dice. There weren't many women and children on the streets, and when two drunken men rode the full length of the block, shooting off their pistols and shouting, "Here it comes! Here it comes!" the saints quickly ran for cover. A few brave onlookers peeked down the street, only to see a lone drummer banging his drum and marching in front of 4 soldiers, who were holding a ragged Confederate flag by its 4 corners. As it got closer, the saints could see a large irregular hole in the center where a cannonball had blown through. The flag brought with it cheers and encouragement from supporters of the secession as the soldiers marched to the flagpole and ran the tattered flag up to the top. Caroline and Eleanor, who had volunteered to buy food for their sisters, could see the general store across the street, but worried how to get past these 2 drunken soldiers on the water, leaning on the water trough in front of the establishment. "Act all business and follow me," said Eleanor, stepping briskly down the steps and starting across the nearly deserted road. The men started laughing and made their way towards them. "You 2 sweet young things want to have a drink with us fine Missouri soldiers?" said one, holding out his bottle of whiskey to the woman as they drew near to the women. Caroline was mortified, but Eleanor wasn't afraid of these military ruffians. She had learned how to deal with cantankerous men when she nursed Titus back to health on the Amazon. No one could be more despicable or hateful than Titus Holt. Looking at his insignia patch, she ventured, "Private, do you have any brothers or sisters?" Taken aback, he stammered, "I've got 3 brothers and 1 younger sister." "How about you, Private?" she said, looking at his companion. "I've got 5 brothers and 3 sisters. I want you 2 to pretend for a moment that we are your sisters. Can you do that?" "Yes," they answered with a snicker. "Would you want drunken soldiers like yourselves to offer your little sisters a bottle of whiskey?" The big boozer stopped his swaying and thought hard. Then his eyes welled up and he became agitated. "Why, I'd pin his ears back and turn him inside out," he said, beginning to snivel. His arrogance had turned into self-loathing, and he started to choke on his sobs. His partner piped up, "I wouldn't tolerate if some drunken bum tried to force himself on my sisters." "Well, privates, now you know how my brother feels about me," she said, pointing to a tall man at the general store entrance, standing with his back to them and towering over everyone around him. "He's right over there." The soldiers were speechless as they took a hard look. Then one sputtered, "He's big." The 2 had never seen such a large man before. They suddenly lost their swagger. "We beg your pardon, ladies," said one as he and his companion tipped their caps and backed away from them sheepishly. As they moved away, Caroline whispered to Eleanor, "I didn't know you had a brother in our company." "I don't," she said, as she smiled and made a subtle wave to Otto, who had just turned around and was grinning broadly as he made a wondering wave back at them. "Well, I guess he is your brother in the gospel," Caroline laughed. "I make it a point to never lie," said Eleanor. After obtaining what little bread there was in town, the food runners were extremely happy to get back to the campground. President Tippett soon learned about the dangerous situation the runners had dealt with. He was apologetic. "Brothers and sisters, that proved to be a huge mistake on my part, and I want to apologize. We won't be sending any sisters into any Missouri towns to buy food from now on. It's just too dangerous. The men of the company will perform that chore while we travel through this state. And even the men should be on guard at all times because of the poisonous mood that is prevalent here." And that's the end of chapter 11. Over and out. Yes.